I've been a Vicar General of the Diocese of San Jose for 11 years, and that's the Diocese of Silicon Valley, if you would. So what I'd like just to do a little bit of housekeeping as we begin. We put on your desk a little bit of SanDisk drive, thumb drive, if you don't have one. Angel has a bag full more. On it are all the presentations that we are not going to give here today, all right? So we don't want to bore you with presentations. We want to have a dialogue. So on here is, there's one presentation you will see a little from Brian about the ethical framework, and we do want you to see that. There's a lot of information on here, including the paper that Brian Greene wrote about this case study. So we encourage you to take that, and there's plenty of them, as I say, and there's no bugs on them, okay? So they're not a bug. They're not a bug device, okay? I promise you, we cleaned them all. They've been there. So what I'm going to do is we're going to do a quick 1-minute introduction for each of the panelists. And then we will basically lay out the case. What we're going to be discussing today is the shooting at the Christ Church in New Zealand and the responses of two major companies, namely Facebook and that of Western Digital, who in its capacity holds, with all their devices that are out there in the technology, holds over 50% of the world's data is stored on a Western Digital device or technology somehow. So they had two different responses. And then at the end of that, we'll have a dialogue about the ethical framework about it. And Brian will bring in the ethical framework on that. And then at the very end, we're going to leave questions for you. Okay, there's going to be four microphones to use, so we want to engage you in this conversation as well. So with no further ado, I'm going to ask if Gavin, if you could leave it off with just a brief 1-minute introduction about who you are.
Hi, my name is Gavin Korn. I am an attorney. I want to make clear, as it says on the agenda, I am here very much in my personal capacity because I was so fascinated by the topic, and when I learned about this from Jim and Father Brendan, very excited about participating because I think this is such a critically important thing that we're discussing at this conference. But I'm not here as a representative of my current employer. Before I began working at Facebook, I was a federal prosecutor with the U.S. Department of Justice for 20 years, working initially on narcotics, then organized crime, and then eventually moved into cybercrime as I kind of followed the progression of organized crime through its evolution.
Thank you.
I'm Brian Greene. I'm the Director of Technology Ethics at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University. I've been working on applied ethics issues in technology for about 10 years, and my background before that was in Catholic moral theology, and particularly issues of human nature and the interaction of technology and human nature. I started in an engineering school, so I've been teaching engineers ethics for quite a while, and now I've been moving more towards the corporate side of things, of how to talk about ethics in corporations, how to improve those dialogues and ways of thinking about and designing products.
I'm Jim Welsh. I'm Senior Vice President at Western Digital. I run all their content solutions business, which is all the products under the SanDisk, WD brands, and G-Tech brands. You all have one of our memory sticks in front of you. I've been with the company for 13 years. We touch a lot of consumers. Every year, my group basically, manages all the products that go throughout the world and touches 330 million consumers every year in various forms, the one that you have in front of you, as well as connected devices, memory that you add to your phone, and all sorts of devices. So we touch a lot of people. We're in the middle of all their digital world.
So I'm Eric Sadobir. I'm a Dominican, and I'm the president of Optic. So this is a network initiated by the Dominicans, but to serve all the Catholic Church and the society. And we try to bridge the gap between the humanities and the tech, and to address those ethical questions that raise with those technologies like artificial intelligence, blockchain, robotics, synthetic biology, and so on. And so we do some ethical research, and we also try to help policymakers on one side and decision makers from the private sector on the other side to make the right choices just by lighting the path.
So to start off the conversation, we had a meeting in Silicon Valley, what we've been calling the Center for Digital Ethics, and we were meeting at Markula Center in Santa Clara, and we were talking about the value of trying to set up a platform which we could learn about helping this industry really make a move towards decisions making. And one of the illustrations that came up in this session was, in fact, about the Christchurch shooting. And so we explored that immediately, and we want to share that exploring today. So to take off the lead, we maybe, Jim, if you could explain how it started out within Western Digital and how your response, and then we'll lead it to Gavin.
So during our discussion, I shared with a group that we were meeting with, we had, it was really interesting because we had just a month before had the incident come through our organization where I received a call from the council from my group mentioning that they had identified an end user had called our call center and identified that somebody was streaming the content that had been captured on Facebook on their personal server. And immediately that call center just escalated and to our legal department to make sure that what was the next step we were going to do, because we've established a culture of empowering people to really surface any issues like that and transparency within the company. So our legal department wanted to make sure in the customer agreement, the user agreement, that we were not breaching anything, and as far as, because we do not look at people's content. But however, if they're streaming to the public, that is enough, and that is not within the agreement. So we were approved. We were within our right to be able to disable that IP address and not permit that user to stream the content. And it was very easy to come up with this conclusion because we had already formulated policies in the company, what we would do overall, but it heightened the awareness within our company too as to the responsibility we have in this area.
So just as a recap, for those of you who may not to recall it, the Christchurch shooting, the terrorist shot, went into two different mosques and showed the stream live on Facebook. Okay, so that's the space we're talking about. Facebook took it down, but it resided on a number of private servers that had got retransmitted through a number of different outlets. One of them, which was at Western Digital through a private network, which falls on Western Digital product. But then inside Facebook, they responded to it, and maybe, Gavin, you could speak a little bit about how they responded to that initial capturing, because it was reported within, I think, 30 minutes. Maybe you could speak a little bit about that.
Even sooner than that. So at Facebook, we've got, or Facebook has, I should say, as I'm here representing me and not Facebook, but they have a huge team of safety people that focus on reports that come in from users. They also have a team globally that engages with the law enforcement community all around the world to make sure that they have contacts in place at any given moment when an incident like this arises so that we can take immediate action. The attacker in the Christchurch shooting live streamed his activity from a first-person perspective for 17 minutes in total on Facebook. Facebook learned about it from the police in New Zealand after about 7 minutes, and within 10 minutes had disabled the video, had taken it down. The video had been seen fewer than 200 times while it was online on Facebook, and no users had reported it. The report came in from the New Zealand police. Over the next 24 hours, Facebook removed approximately 1.5 million copies of the video as users attempted to push it virally across the platform. Approximately 1.2 million of those were taken down before upload. So they were caught as part of our efforts to try to be able to get ahead of the problem and prevent it from spreading. The first user to report the video reported it about 12 minutes after the broadcast ended. So that was the first time somebody from the public reported it to Facebook, but it had already been taken down. Although we took a lot of steps to try to prevent the spread of the video on our platform, and there was something like 900 versions of the video that were detected. And when I say versions, what happens is when people are trying to get around controls that are put in place to prevent content from appearing on a platform like Facebook, they'll do things like take a video of the video with their phone and upload that. They'll edit the video. They'll add additional screenshots or modifications to the video. All of these things enable video in certain circumstances or images to overcome hashing algorithms that we use to prevent uploads. So when content like this is identified, Facebook uses a hashing technology to create essentially a fingerprint of the content, and the hashing technology is not, some of you may be familiar, for example, with MD5 hashes, which are extraordinarily specific. It's instead a hashing algorithm that has some flexibility that will catch modifications to content, and it can be very effective in preventing similar or slightly modified versions of the content from being shared. But there were many, many iterations on the content that people were attempting to upload. Additionally, Facebook used some audio technology hashing to try to take advantage of the fact that there was audio in the video as another mechanism of identifying it and preventing it from being uploaded. Facebook also blocked URLs where the video was being shared, put limitations on search terms that could be used to find the video, and also shared with other companies instances where we saw the video was being shared on their platforms. And then finally, working with an organization that we helped create a couple of years ago called the GIFCT, it's the Global Internet Forum for Countering Terrorism, we created a while ago a hash sharing coalition among companies to be able to push out hashes that we create with them to prevent the spread or hosting of content that they might find to violate their terms on their platforms. So the hashes were also shared there in order to try to prevent the spread. Of course, despite all these efforts, the video did go viral, and it was, in fact, published by many news outlets as well as hosted on a number of platforms.
So there was an interesting distinction between the amount of time that Facebook was able to remove it and the amount of time that you had as a company, because there's two different technology at place. And so one being your AI assisted at Facebook, and you are largely human-based because you're dealing with not as many. So maybe you could talk a little bit about first the response time that that Western Digital had, and the background and the culture you have inside your organization of why it happened the way it happened, and then maybe you could respond back with what you...
Yeah, well, the time zone was a factor. So when we were notified that from the time we were alerted to the time we took it down, it was a 3-hour time from the customer service, because it was our customer service that supported the time zone at that point, and then to escalate it. So it did highlight the urgency around changing our processes so that we be more responsive. Our goal is to really shrink it down to less than an hour overall. But the policies that we had put in place had obviously given a framework to go and make sure that we just want to make sure at this point, after this fact, to go even further and reinforce the training. So we have built in a process within the company where quarterly we have a review of the training, because you do have some turnover in the organization, to make sure that we can manage that. We have artificial intelligence, the beginnings of artificial intelligence in a lot of our connected products, but they're more to aid the end user. We do not look at people's content, so it's a little more difficult. In the streaming, where we have is a process of capturing, if ever we're alerted of any activity, we do have a system of alerts that, from points that come in, customer service being probably the primary one, our legal department, the various areas, we watch that very carefully. But now, going forward with our products, our product management group gives some thought. We talked about earlier architecture of our products, how, we have to think through this of what's the exposure to the company overall, and how do we, make sure that we manage that correctly overall, and we give forethought in our products, how they are used.
Thank you, Jim. So, Gavin, and so what was the ethical dilemmas inside Facebook in which, when dealing with taking it down, and what are the processes that kick in inside? Can you say a little bit about that?
I would say in terms of ethical dilemmas, none. This is one area. The prior discussion focused a lot on issues that are much, much more difficult to ethically to balance. Issues related to human safety, it's very, very simple. And I think it's not something that really any of the companies that we talk to struggle with. They want to do the right thing, and they want to prevent harm to the users or to the public. The difficulties come in how to do things quickly enough to prevent the harm. That is a challenge. Companies like Facebook, Google, Twitter, large companies that have huge user bases, obviously have a lot more resources to throw at safety to make sure that their users are safe and the public is safe. And we have really well-crafted policies in place. We have the terms of service that, for example, Jim discussed on his platform, carefully crafted to make sure that we prevent any content that would pose harm to the public from appearing on the platform. We prohibit terrorist organizations from even having any presence on the platform. The same for other dangerous organizations, criminal organizations, et cetera. So there's a lot of room in terms of applying our standards, developing the artificial intelligence to help get this in front of a human reviewer faster, critically important. And it's something that's beyond the capability of any one company to do. Ideally, it requires assistance from others. And so one of the things you may have seen after the Christchurch shooting, we reached out to a bunch of law enforcement contacts to try to obtain additional training material that we could use to build classifiers or artificial intelligence to help detect these sorts of scenarios sooner. And recently, on September 17th, there was a public announcement around the City of London Police supporting this effort, I think it's the Metropolitan Police in London, supporting this effort by, for example, providing training video from cameras that they're going to wear during training to help build detection models.
So let's step back a look. Now, we've talked about the case specifically, but maybe, Brian, you wrote about this case from a framework which Santa Clara uses. So maybe you could speak a little bit about the framework that's more generic, that talks about the whole framework of ethics, not just from this specific case. That might help us then lead into some more detailed questions about this.
Right. So I'll just talk a little bit about, as a transition, kind of a little bit of the complexities that were involved in the case, and then we'll move towards the framework. So, as Gavin was saying, the moral component of this case is straightforward. There was not a debate about whether this should be removed from their platform or anything about, this is a terrorist act, it just needs to be removed. However, there is a lot of complexity that ripples into the case and out of the case. So at the sociocultural level, for example, racism, sectarianism, globalization, these are all at play in this incident that happened. There are also government regulations involved with firearms, privacy, freedom of information, international coordination, corporate law, and all sorts of those things. At the technological level, there are multiple technologies obviously involved with that, including technologies to make videos, technologies to share those videos, the existence of highly lethal firearms that individuals can own, personal computers and electronic devices, and video editing technology and other ways of trying to get around some of the detection technologies. And then, of course, at the moral and personal level, where terrorism and heroism clashed with each other, not only in the initial incident where people attempted to resist the shooter, but also in the ongoing struggle over removing the content from online while, there are many other people out there who are trying to promote this content. So the circumstances around the case are very complicated, but the moral aspect of it is also very clear. However, the moral complexity doesn't just disappear, it doesn't just involve going into the case and then there's also coming out of the case, because lots of sub-cases ripple forth from the original case, including things like balancing the values between freedom of the press, respect for victims, and exactly how you're going to make those balances. Is it okay to share this type of video through a news organization, or how is society going to make those decisions about that, whether that is a violation of respect for victims, families, and things like that. So as the complexity increases, whether in circumstantial factors around the case or ripples emerging from it, and numerous ethical situations that are analogous to this, or even if they're just more general cases, one of the things that the Markkula Center has is tools that we produce in order to try to think about ethical decision-making. So for 3 decades now, the Markkula Center has been developing these sorts of tools. As an applied ethics center, we try to make sure that we're taking ethical theory and that we're applying it directly to places where people need to use it in reality, whether we're talking about technology ethics or business ethics or government ethics or bioethics. We strive to make sure that the ethics that we're talking about is actually fundamentally useful to people. This is especially apparent in the field of technology, where these decisions need to be made in very often a time-compressed scale or under conditions of competition, as they were talking about in the earlier panel. More and more ethical questions are arising because technology does more and more to empower us to do things that we couldn't do in the past. If technology is giving us power, then it's a question of, with that new power, what choices are we going to make based on that power, choices that we didn't have to make in the past. So we can think of it in terms of being humanity was involuntarily constrained by its weakness in the past. So in the past we had less power, we had fewer choices to make. However, now with more power, we have to learn to be voluntarily constrained by ethics. So the ethical decisions and ethical judgment that we bring to bear on these powers are now how we're going to constrain our ability to do things. So technology gives us unprecedented efficiency, but if we don't direct this efficiency towards good, we're going to come to live in a terrible world. And I think that's one of the fundamental things that we need to consider here. If we make evil really efficient and really easy to do, we're going to live in a world where evil is causing a lot of problems in our world. On the other hand, if we make it very easy to do good things, then hopefully more good things will happen. And because technology is constantly making that balance between making things easier and then we have to figure out how to direct it, this is going to be one of the fundamental, moral, philosophical, policy, all sorts of things that we have to apply to this. This is going to be a fundamental problem of our time. We want to learn to become good, efficient at doing good things, and we want to try to apply technology in a way that makes bad things inefficient, make them difficult. And with respect to human intelligence and artificial intelligence, intelligence and power give us choices, and ethics tells us which among those choices are good. So with these combinations, we have to figure out exactly what we're going to do. So having more choices is not just good in itself. Good only appears when those choices are directed towards good ends which facilitate human and environmental survival and flourishing. And with that background, I'd like to introduce a few of our ethical tools. You want to say something?
No, so the question that jumps out from those words was this: that with more good comes more responsibility. It sounds like the Spider-Man approach. But the question is coming back down to what was said at the last session: is that of setting up the foundation for common good. Does the ethical framework allow you to define this good and then include and encourage participation in the defining of that foundation? Because it seems to me that we have to, first of all, find a way to define what is this common good. And the question is, does the framework lead us there, or are we starting from somewhere? Do we have to have that first?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I think what I should do is I should go through the tools a little bit, and then that question of the content of the good, I think, is a really important one.
So, Angel, maybe you could just switch that, just you show that for a second, just to give us the framework.
So some of the materials that we created at the Markkula Center include materials called Ethics and Technology Practice. So the framework for ethical decision-making is basically a very general framework. It's meant for use in all cases. It's not a formula for simple solutions, but it's a process for managing ethical complexity. It is a process for better understanding ethical problems, and it's a way of hopefully perceiving better choices and ultimately making better choices. So the very first part of the Markkula Center framework for ethical decision-making is to figure out, is there an ethical issue here? It turns out when I'm working, with various, groups of people, if you're not attuned to the fact that there are ethical problems in the work, this is the very first thing you have to realize, is that there is an ethical issue here that needs to be recognized and dealt with. What values and risks are involved? Who are the stakeholders? And those sorts of questions. Then once you've recognized the issue, you have to get the facts. What do we need to know? What do we need to learn about this case? We need to evaluate alternative actions through multiple ethical lenses. So this is where we start getting to the content questions. We look at 5 ethical lenses at the Markkula Center. We build those into the framework, and I'll talk about those in a moment. Once you look at these problems through the various lenses, then you have to start the process of making a decision. And once you think you have a decision, then you want to mentally test it and think to yourself, how would a TV audience think about this? What would social media think about this? What would happen if I was called in front of a courtroom in order to defend this decision? Do you have a defensible position here? And lastly, you want to actually act on it. You want to take that decision that you believe is the right decision to make in this case and ask yourself, how did it turn out, and reflect upon it. So also we have the Ethics and Technology Practice curriculum. This was created by Shannon Valor, who's right there, if she wants to raise her hand. And also myself and my colleague Irina Raiku at the Markkula Center. It was funded by the Midyar Network's Tech Society and Solutions Lab and piloted at Alphabet's X organization, which is kind of their moonshot division of Alphabet, where they're constantly trying to do more different things that are beyond what other people are doing. We've had many of these workshops where we've gone out to corporations and have started talking about these things and even customizing the work customizing the workflow for the organization. And then we also have ways of, if you don't want to customize it directly to the organization, we have available resources on the website. So all these resources are available for free on the Markkula Center website. This is just what part of it looks like. So we have not only kind of an overview and talking about the conceptual frameworks, but also talking about the case studies. We have case studies there for samples. And then we have an ethics toolkit and sample design workflow and how to integrate those things. And like I was saying at the start, the Markkula Center for Ethical Decision Making. So the toolkit consists of 7 tools. I'm not going to go through them all, but if you want to look at them, you can go to the website and talk about them. These do start getting into the content issues. For example, though, if you're looking at, for example, number 6, think about the terrible people. People are going to take whatever technological opportunities you give to them, and they're going to take that and think about ways to do horrible things with it. For example, the case that we're looking at right now. And if you were thinking about that ahead of time, you can develop ways to prevent that or at least control it when it does start happening. As Gavin was talking about, they had those control measures in place, and it was a matter of just speed and working with what other people or doing, for example, other bad actors out there trying to manipulate the video. This is just a sample design workflow. And then we have various implementation examples. And, all those, like I said, are available on the website.
So I want to pause there and go back to something. If you're talking about trying to, so now let's look at a more of a global aspect, from global company to global companies that are involved in this. What are what is the system that we can create where, from all the way from concept of an engineering thinking of designing a product to all the way to delivering or executing that product? Can there be a system put in place where everywhere along the line everybody is asking? And then specifically, I'm thinking of some of the more successful design systems like total quality management, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But is there what can we do inside companies? Maybe Gavin, you can talk about it, and then what you've done inside W.
So one thing, in a way, I look at ethical issues as kind of the new cybersecurity for corporations. And what I mean is, a few years ago, because the cybersecurity experts inside companies were never a profit center, it was very, very difficult for them to get the attention of their CEOs and the C-suite folks to take action to mitigate risks before they became a problem. Over time, over and over and over again, companies learned the hard way that if they weren't prepared ahead of time and they weren't constantly investing in the process of cybersecurity, which is a never-ending update. It's like painting a bridge where you finish at one end and you're back to the beginning. You just have to keep going and going and going, that they were going to pay the price in terms of reputation severely. And things have changed a lot now, where the companies now most companies are much, much more aware of the risks there and much more focused on trying to remediate them early, even though they're not driving profit. I think this is in a similar space right now. So anytime a product is created, the one point that you raised that really rings true with me is think about the awful. As somebody who spent my entire career as a prosecutor trying to protect the weak from harm, spending all of my time dealing with the horrible, that's unfortunately what my mind goes to first in almost every circumstance. But it's important for companies to have people like me who can flag these issues, because, to be honest, the average developer is, quite frankly, naive in many respects. They don't understand because they don't think of things in the way that truly evil people do. And so they'll create a product only really being able to understand the good that it can propose without really thinking through how it's going to be abused. So having teams within companies that can focus on those issues and making sure that they get the attention they need from the product teams, from the development teams, to be integrated into that flow, to try to remediate those risks as to whatever extent as possible during the development of the products, so that they're built with this in mind, is extremely important. And I think it's also very important for the companies to work together on these issues, to support each other in the development of tools. Because as you saw in the Christchurch context, it doesn't really matter if one company really tries to button up their act on this. If we're all connected in a global internet, it's going to go somewhere else. And so those smaller companies that don't have the resources to throw at these problems need to be aided by other companies. And this shouldn't be viewed through a competition lens. This is not an area of competition, it's an area of collaboration.
So Jim, maybe you could speak a little bit about that as well. The thing I'm trying to balance, and it comes from the last session, I hear the need to collaborate, but I also hear the fundamental basis for business in Silicon Valley is competition. And ferocious was the way Reed described it, ferocious competition. How do you balance the need for ethical decision-making as a system through your whole company, which WD has got awards for, which is designed from beginning to execution, to balancing competition, which are not doing that and have no net worth for it?
Yeah, in our instance, we view like Facebook as very complementary to what we do. Google, Facebook, the large companies where the content is shared overall as a platform, and our platform is more of a platform, private platform. We don't have a direct competitor that does, really private sharing to the extent on any appliance like we do. And, you do have content that's shared with these directly, but that doesn't go public. It's private, and that's been a big part. Big premise of ours is privacy and security of people's content, because there's a big concern about users of the security of their content. So we're constantly pulled between people want privacy, and then also when they do share, it's no longer private. And so the collaboration is extremely critical. As a matter of fact, Gavin and I sparked a conversation about over a year ago. I was sharing with him with some of our appliances that share content and said, do you worry about this? We were worried about it, but not to the extent we should be. And I think that, we started the dialogue within our company, as far as what's the framework we're going to build, and let's formalize this. Let's make sure that we have a process that educates everybody. So it's this conversation that happens between companies that is today somewhat unorganized way, because we happen to have our kids go to the same Catholic school, and we were on the chairlift skiing together. But we were talking about this because we think we really are passionate about what we do. And a lot of the people on my team are passionate about what we do. But the awareness, you've got to create the awareness. And, we can't wait to be regulated. We want to do what's right. Because, people, you don't get profit indirectly. Your reputation gets tarnished. Consumers don't want to buy your products anymore. So there is that. There is that incentive too. On top of it, we want to do what's right. Western Digital was awarded as one of the top companies, most ethical companies in the world. We're really proud about that. But I think we can do even more. We want to continue to shine in this area. So the processes and the teaching of the organization of, what's the framework, what are the conditions, what are the types of content that we should be looking at, and what are the points that we are responsible for in the architecture of our products, especially the connected products. How do we make sure that we think about this issue of social responsibility and making sure that our products are put to the good of the people? So we've got a lot of work to do. We've begun, but we don't think we're far from complete overall. With my team, we constantly talk about how can we do better? How can we make sure that, especially when you have turnover, that people get into this culture and we really bring them up to speed very quickly. And every day we think about this as we design the products, as we design our support systems, our services overall, that thought process becomes embedded in our philosophy, in our culture.
So at the last session, they spoke about the development of a common good. And what do you think we can do as industry in Silicon Valley, given that its reputation around the world is to build fast, break it, and then innovate and break it, sort of disrupting itself? Is there something that we can do to set some sort of broad common standard or broad common ground that we can build on, that everyone can participate in, that everyone will? You spoke of, Gavin, the organization, the Global Internet Forum. Maybe that's the beginning of something, but it seems like it can't be the industry itself alone. But the question then, who? Because the thing that comes to my mind is it's moving so fast. Unless we do something immediately, we're going to lose control of it very fast.
Yeah, so things like Brian has created, I think, are tremendously helpful. Standards, ways to think of things, ways that can easily be adopted by companies and plugged into a process. that help them think through development, I think are extremely helpful. The other thing that is very, very helpful is giving clear areas within the law under which companies or industry can work together with academics, with other companies, with civil society, et cetera, to build out the sort of safety structures that are needed to prevent harm, which requires an awful lot of engagement and sharing of information very frequently. And that's an area where I think a lot of companies struggle because there's a huge amount of inconsistency under the law, both domestically and internationally, around what can and cannot be done. Very frequently, the approach to problems is to focus on a very specific problem and to develop a very specific solution legislatively in a particular country, but there is no kind of uniformity across threat types and across jurisdictions. If there were more flexibility in that area and more of a framework under which I think companies could work together, I think you'd see a lot more collaboration and a lot more effect.
One of the things that you mentioned earlier, Gavin, was the security, but there is no standard for security, right? So there's no systemic standard for security. Every community, and in fact, we hear of breaches of security more than we hear of if everything was fine, but we hear breaches of security constantly. So it seems to me like there still needs to be some sort of set of systems or standards. And again, standards are no good unless they're actually complied with. So I'm trying to think of one example, and we've talked about this before as a group, I know, but many of you are familiar with it's an old program now called the Total Quality Management. It's a system, it's an ISO standard. It sets up a rigorous policies and procedures and certification and compliance. But there's largely no manufacturer in the world today who is not using ISO 9001. But that took 40 years to develop. I'm wondering if, and they've since developed a new ISO standard 14001 for the environmental impacts. Is it possible, and this is a question for everyone on the panel, is it possible that we can set up a system similar to that? Now, acknowledging we have to do this much faster, we can't do it over 40 years. Largely, if we do it over 40 years, we'll miss, AI will have taken off. So what can we do? Is it possible, first of all, to have a system, and what will be the first steps? So, anyone?
I think what we need is, I think that, as Gavin mentioned, Markula Center initiative framework, I think, is a good start because it's a neutral ground where you can start, overall. Because the ISO is more of it's got a more technical aspect. I'm not as familiar as a lot of our technical team is into that. But I think it certainly can be incorporated, and there's got to be work that has to be done rapidly. We as companies could work and use you in this, as a moderator to make that happen and incorporate it. I think it could be a direction that we can take. I'd like to see that. I would like.
So I would say one of the things that's happening is I think that conversations like this are the beginning, right? If we're talking about the beginning of how to build these structures and really try to transform the world, then we need to have conversations to begin with, and then we need to start making plans of action. Now, individual corporations are taking their own paths. They're each going the way that works for them in their particular place. But as everyone here has been saying, if we have different responses all around the world, that's not going to work. We need to make sure that there's something coherent that brings people together. Having an ethical foundation for that is one of the most important things to hopefully build something that is widely, followed, widely understood and agreed upon, and hopefully it has an ethical standard. And this is where it becomes very interesting to get into the content of the good and the pluralism of values and things like that, is that you want to have a system which is universal, but at the same time, a universal system ends up being very thin in terms of what people are agreeing upon. If you have a thicker system where people are more in deep agreement with each other, then it's more likely that people around the world are not going to agree with it. And so you're constantly having to balance these against each other in terms of wide acceptance and also depth of how much is actually being talked about or understood there.
I'd also say that you're right about the amount of time it took to build the ISO standard that you referenced, but there is an ISO standard also for cybersecurity, 27001, which was developed in a much shorter period of time. There's also the NIST cybersecurity framework. There are others. So maybe we can see this rapidly evolving. Again, if you look at cybersecurity as kind of like the precursor to ethics being integrated, that there is room for a fast development of these sorts of standards, not necessarily prescriptive to every single situation, but certainly helpful in terms of a framework or something that you could use as a baseline or to reference when building a system for each individual case.
So I immediately try to come to say, how do we implement something like this on a global level? You need some burning issue, some burning platform where everyone is going to agree to. We already know from what Mitchell Baker said this morning that even on the women's issue, which some of the world will readily agree that women need access to all decision making, but there are communities that won't. The one thing that strikes me is something that Bishop Paul Tai brought up at the very beginning of the session was that of this need for the understanding of what common dignity, the common human dignity and awareness of it. I'm wondering, and he brought up the idea of that we all agree on human trafficking is an evil in the world, and but could we all take up Pope Francis' call to say, can we name that one common issue? Let's say human trafficking of children, just that, and narrow our focus and say, okay, we got all these other problems we're going to solve, but can we, as an entire global community, use every resource we have to expunge within our, obviously, we would love to expunge, but to do every technology product will be certified to, it will never allow for technology, never allow. What would it take to develop a system where everyone's going to agree to? I guess that's what I'm trying to see. What's the one common issue? I mean, we can talk about common ground, but we need some one burning platform that we can all get behind. It seems to me everyone we've ever talked to will agree that human trafficking of children is the most deplorable, but can we even do it for that?
We could certainly get behind it.
So what would be the first steps that we would need to take?
I think as a company, we can 100% get behind it. I think that would be one we could. There are a lot of them, but that's probably could go at the top very easily. I don't know where we would start.
There's already frameworks for this in many different areas. One of the problems is very different approaches are taken for those different areas. So, for example, the GIFT-CT focuses on terrorism. The GIFT-CT is now expanding their scope to focus on a broader category, so not just global terrorist organizations, but other forms of terrorism, et cetera. It's expanding, it's growing. That's a good thing in the context of child safety. In the U.S., there's a framework around the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Took an act of Congress to put that in place, but every company that operates in this jurisdiction complies with the requirements under that statute to try to prevent any sharing of child exploitive images. So there are many frameworks to look at that could provide models and trying to pick the best of all of these, and then creating the ability for the companies through either through legislation or agreements internationally to be able to do certain things to accomplish the good we're aiming at under those. I think if you create the avenue,
right,
people will follow it.
Yes.
So what do we think, and maybe Brian, you can speak to this, what are the initial steps of foundation? You talked about, the thin versus the thick. If we could all agree on one, is this a thick issue or is this a thin issue?
So hopefully something like human trafficking would be something that people could agree upon. worldwide, and yet we know, for example, that there are some places in the world where this is, where even it may be in the shadows, but there are people who are not trying to stop it, perhaps as much as they could. So, however, I think that on an issue like that there should be a way to get to. I mean, we have international law on this, right? The United Nations has treaties that have to do with the well-being of children and other groups of people. And if we can take those international treaties and regimes that already exist and perhaps actually enforce them or deploy them in some new way that makes it more effective, then I think that would be definitely one path to take.
So, at this point, I want to open up to the larger group and ask the panelists some questions, and maybe not narrowed to this last conversation, but in general to any of those. So, if you just raise your hand, there's a number of microphones going around. If you wish, you could direct it to the person.
My name's Paul Toomey. I used to be the CEO of ICANN, but before that ran 2 government agencies in Australia. I wanted to take this discussion up one level to where we were in the previous discussion, because I think Reid and Mitchell both accepted that the ethical discussion in Silicon Valley and perhaps even less so in Beijing and Shanghai and Shenzhen is basically utilitarianism. Which matches with capitalism and the libertarian view of California. But if you look at the response of some governments to the terrorism thing, take the Australian New Zealand government responses to Abe straight after, or look what the Sri Lankan government eventually did with Facebook and turn it off about the issues of false news. I don't want to get into the fake news story, but the false news around sectarian disputes. It strikes me that even at governmental levels, they don't buy into utilitarianism. They have a different perspective about what the ethics is. So I want to challenge this discussion, and I want to challenge ISO standards separately, but a discussion which simply says, let's have a discussion around capitalism and utilitarianism and we'll amend the product, is not necessarily an ethical perspective. And it may end up with this problem thin and thick. But for some governments, for a lot of governments, security of my citizens, or perception of security of my citizens, far outweighs any commercial benefit to any company, or that my kid can put up a video. And so I just want to challenge that and see the reaction. But it strikes me this panel is essentially accepting utilitarianism with a bit of fringes, and I'm not sure that's, even at governmental levels, an accepted model for ethical discussion.
Gavin, do you want to speak or go?
Obviously, complying with laws in every country around the world is difficult for any global company. At the same time, there are many governments around the world that I think most people globally would agree are not necessarily behaving ethically. And their laws may not be crafted in an ethical manner and may not be applied ethically. So these are bigger issues. I wouldn't say, speaking from a personal perspective, my view is not one that buys. I might not be the typical Silicon Valley person in terms of how I think, but I think the issues are much more complex than a simply utilitarian approach to these problems, and there is validity to different perspectives on where priorities should be placed in different cultures around the world. But there are certain core principles, personally, I believe in, that flow from what Monsignor Duffy spoke to, which I think underpins everything that I conceptualize as natural law, which I personally believe in very strongly, which is love. And what you do to people you love, how you protect people you love. One way that I look at it personally, and I think we should all, in Silicon Valley or anywhere where you're developing products or services that can impact people around the world, is what would you do to protect your own child? When I think of, I'm only, again, from the last panel, I only feel as well as my child who feels at his worst. And that is a reflection of love, caring about somebody to that extent. And if we are not thinking about how services can keep people safe and prevent harm to those children, just as we would want our own children protected. I think something's lacking. Now, how you get to the point where companies can align on developing products that really bake that into the development, I think it's important. There's never going to be a one-size solution to these problems. You're never going to make every nation happy. You're never, and there's probably going to have to be variations in the way things are applied, depending on circumstances. So, for example, Facebook, Twitter, a lot of companies, they will comply with local law, but the services that they're applying, it's kind of a geo-blocked approach. So you in country X say that this video cannot be shown because you find it offensive, but other countries around the world don't. And so we try to find a core principle that the vast majority of society agrees with. I don't think that's impossible. And I think it does come down to the very basic principles of natural law that are founded and grounded in the concept of law.
So just to build on that, your question raised something that I forgot to talk about, which was actually the 5 lenses that are built into the ethical framework that the Markkula Center uses. Utilitarianism is one of them. There's also a common goods framework. There's also human rights. There's also a justice framework, and also a virtue ethics framework. And we like to use those 5 lenses within the framework for ethical decision-making for illuminating different aspects of ethical problems. So you're right, if you're only using one lens, you're going to miss a lot of stuff. The way the Markkula Center framework tries to deal with that is by saying, look through all 5 of the lenses. Each one is going to highlight different things, and based on that, you need to make a decision that is broadly defensible, because you know that people are going to be looking at you from different lenses, because different people have different preferences in terms of what lenses they use. Now, I say the word preferences, and that hopefully raises some question mark in your mind that says, are they just preferences? Isn't there something more solid here to work with? And the different groups of people around the world, like I said, are going to come to different conclusions on a lot of things, and you once again have to deal with the pluralism problem. But there are some universals, hopefully, that people can agree upon. And if you're looking at something, for example, from a virtue ethics framework, virtue ethics is a framework that I like to use, because you can go to almost every culture in the world. Every culture that I know of all has a conception of courage, for example. They all have a conception of self-control. They might have different content for how exactly that plays out in their culture, but with that virtue exists, at least that concept exists there. And then it's a question about how do you get more solid goods out of those character traits? How do you develop that in a way that gets you something concrete and defensible, and something that really works in the way that particular society operates? And hopefully all around the world we can come up with something we could agree upon together.
And I'm supposed to intervene only at the end, but just to jump for 1 second in the conversation, I mean, the big difficulty is just to flip from one of those lenses to the other one. And a way, I mean, we're also facing the same difficulties. A way to do that is to use this tool of ethics of discussion built by Habermas, which allows to be more inclusive in the way we put everybody in the loop. I don't know if you're familiar with the philosophy of Habermas, but the point is just it's very often used in medical ethics. The point is to put everybody, all the stakeholders in the same room, around the same table, and just to help them to align their views. And it doesn't mean that only the majority decides what has to be done, because it can be terrible. But it means that also it helps everybody to share his own vision and to have a real 3D model of what has to be done. And very often, I mean, the solution doesn't come from what we expect. Just an example, in medical ethics, for example, about HIV protocols, in the very beginning, they were doing some things like embryo cells and so on in rats. And at some point, all the doctors were okay with that. And someone who was just cleaning said, but I have a problem. When I have to incinerate those rats, I cannot consider them as just animals. They have something human inside. And so there was a kind of big reflection. And from that, they decided to abandon completely this protocol, which seemed to be satisfying, but actually, ethically speaking, it was not. And I think that perhaps that's a way to put more stakeholders around the table just to make a decision.
So we want to take another question there.
Father Eric, your contributions are always welcome at any time, so no problem at all. Okay, we have one question here, then a man over there, and a second one over there. Okay?
Hello, I'm Robert Ballasar. I manage new media for the Jesuit Courier in Rome. Before that, I was a technology journalist in the Silicon Valley. I find it interesting that we had this exact conversation at DEF CON and Black Hat this year in August. And it's centered around the same ideas, which was how do we stop certain actions in the internet community? In this particular case, we're talking about child exploitation, or we're talking about the Christchurch shooting. In DEF CON, we also talked about bots, botnets, fake news, this dissemination of information designed to influence people. And one of the things that kept coming up was we were hitting a dead road whenever someone wanted to advocate a technology solution to stop the activity. Because as technologists, we know that's not possible. That will never exist, because and Facebook has experience with this. Every time you develop a technological solution to stop a specific action, they just modify it slightly and that goes away. So where we refocused was not how do we create technologies to stop an action, but rather how do we change the way we think about technologies to encourage better behavior. And I think that's very well suited for this panel and for this conference. Is there a way that you can get all of the major technology thought leaders together and agree not to implement a specific technology, but rather to do something like allowing people to have anonymity and at the same time having a verified reputation through a trusted third source that allows you to reward good behavior and penalize bad behavior? Again, I don't want to get into a specific technical solution, but that seems like a much better use of our time, to look at the behavior rather than the actions.
Gavin, do you want to say something to that? Or?
I mean, I think it's a brilliant observation. It's absolutely correct that we're never going to stop evil. We're not going to stop people from doing terrible things. That's not a feasible goal. The goal is to mitigate it as much as possible, to increase friction as much as possible to make it difficult. But I think it's more complex than just. As you say, there's kind of got to be incentives and disincentives. Years ago, when I was a narcotics prosecutor, a young narcotics prosecutor, I was sent to speak to a group of weed and seed individuals in a community in Lawrence, Massachusetts, which had a very high drug trafficking problem. And we went around the table, and everybody talked about the most amazing things that they were doing, after-school programs to keep kids out of trouble, focusing on education, psychologists providing free services, all these things that people were doing. And went around the table, and it came to me. I said, well, what do you do? I said, I get involved after everything you do fails. And I hate to say that, but I only have one tool, and it's a big, giant hammer. Very blunt, and it's not very precise. And frankly, I don't like to use it. But it is an important part of the overall response. So just like I very often hear people say, when are we going to stop fighting the war on drugs? It's pointless. You'll never win the war on drugs. I would respond, we're not going to win the war on murder either. But we don't stop prosecuting people from committing murder because it hurts people. But we should do more than just that. We should also look for ways to try to convince people to behave better. That will never be completely successful either, but it's these combination of approaches that gives us the best chance of minimizing the harm.
So one of the, just to speak to that, is one of the things that has been successful is how do we inspire and influence? Well, to use the utilitarian approach is that disabling profit encourages good behavior, right? I mean, that's what you want to get. So you disable profit by having people leave you. So people are voting with their feet, then that is a way to disable or encourage a switch of behavior. What we were trying to say is there a way in which we could inspire a systemic approach to this? Is there a way in which we could systemically have everyone look for that badge that I have signed up for these ethics standards and I comply to them as a company? And that there is some sort of process inside that they get that. That's what I guess we were trying to get to let's take another question.
Thank you. I'm Jovan Kurbalija. I just completed a task of being executive director of a UN high-level panel on digital cooperation, established by Mr. Guterres, with the aim to draft some sort of social contract, and we submitted the report in June this year. And based on that process, I may just make a few contributions to this discussion and maybe answer a few questions that you posed. One is that through the consultation process, which lasted 12 months, we have been hearing two echoing messages. One is we need a clarity. Citizens, individuals, companies basically were asking for clarity. No tech language, no UN language, but clarity. Second question, which was asked frequently, is whom we call to answer our digital problems. And it is not surprising that you have nowadays Paris call, you have Christchurch call, you have Zuckerberg's call for the regulation. There are many calls, but nobody is answering. And that is the major problem which we try to address in this report. What we also discovered is that there are a few assumptions which were mentioned today as well in our discussion, is that Internet is global and it needs global solutions. I think that has to be challenged. It is a global technologically, but it is very local in its impact. Therefore, we have to have sometimes very local solutions. Therefore, that is one assumption which put climate change negotiation in Copenhagen in huge risk, and we spent almost 5 years to recover climate change till Paris. That rather naive view that global problems could be solved only with global solutions. Are there mechanisms for solving the problems? Yes, we identified more than 1,000 digital policy mechanisms. Therefore, they are not lacking. The problem is that there is a huge confusion and lack of clarity. And I would conclude with probably one finding that is on pessimistic side, but also realistic and wake-up call. And I would like use the analogy with telegraph negotiations. At the beginning of the 20th century, governments were negotiated for 10 years, telegraph regulation, till Titanic happened. And since thousands of people were not saved exactly for the reason that Marconi telegraph couldn't communicate to Telefunken, in 6 months, the new radio regulation was adopted, and it is still in force till today. I hope we won't wait for Titanic moment. We as humanity should do better. But element of political will rises is as important as rational understanding and mapping the political challenges. Those are just a few reflections from the work of the panel that may help our discussion over the next 3 days.
Was there anything in your findings that would help us find a common set of standards or policies or procedures that can set a foundation? I mean, it seems like there's 1,000 is not enough. I mean, that's too many. We need one or two. Is there one area that you think that has a common understanding?
Some of them were listed, and I think it was very useful this morning. We started creating taxonomy of core values, inclusivity. I think trust was missing this morning, fairness, dealing with inequalities. Those are what we did in panel. We identify core values, analyze how are they applied to the digital reality, and discuss the mechanisms. Therefore, the panel outlines more or less values that were mentioned this morning. Plus, I would say harmony was introduced as one of the values, yes.
Very helpful, thank you. Anyone make any comments on it? I think there was another question down here, was there?
Thank you. My name is Jim Keenan. I teach ethics at Boston College. I think one of the things that I'm finding rather interesting is a certain fluidity between what we mean by ethics and then the common good. I don't think that all ethical systems necessarily have as significant a place in their agenda as with the notion of common good. So, like your question was about utilitarian ethics, and that doesn't necessarily always engage the common good. What I find very helpful with this conference is the naming of the common good as being the platform from which we're having this discussion. However, we seem to go into Habermas, Spinoza, Kant, a variety of different philosophical thoughts that gave birth to a variety of other systems of ethical thought. And I do want to just remind us all that working with the common good gives us a particular language game, a particular set of concepts, a particular focus that allows us to say what we mean by the ethical. So it's not simply, we're not talking about ethics in the digital age, we're talking about the common good in the digital age. And a second point to follow from that is that one question we could ask ourselves is not solely to specify what the common good is, as if we could exhaust what that means, whether by naming goods or by talking about the concept itself. But it generally functions heuristically. It generally functions by pointing us in a direction of mindfulness about the common good, something that a utilitarian ethics often does not. So what concretely does this mean? When you answer about using love, I think that's commendable, but you know, the Catholic theological tradition talked about love a great deal in teaching moral theology, but rarely did it engage the common good directly until more recently when the common good entered into personal moral theology, entered into bioethics, and entered into other systems of ethical teaching. So I just would like to highlight the priority that this conference has given to the common good as very particular platform that would help us to be more focused and not to go into a variety of ethical tangents.
Yeah, thank you. There's two more questions over here, comments. Just on that, it does help us to refocus back our own analysis this morning here, going back to maybe we should go back to using the one framework that you have on Market Center is to use the common good and maybe blend in what you would suggest as justice as well, which are complementary in their both input and output. So go ahead, Urs.
Good morning. My name is Anna. I come from Digital Affairs Ministry, Poland. I'm dealing with artificial intelligence and ethics also. I have a question. I'm very happy that we have mentioned clarity in technology, because I completely agree that we need a trustworthy technology. Otherwise, people have to trust in the technology. The panel has mentioned that many companies, they are using the algorithms and artificial intelligence to take decision. And this leads us to the question of bias. So bias because of the gender, color of the skin, even political preferences. I would like to ask and hear from the panelists what would be the solution to make the technology more trustworthy for the citizens and avoid the biases. Thank you.
So this is actually something that we had been talking about with the Optic meeting prior to this. We talked a lot about bias. We had a whole session on it. And it's an extremely complicated situation because you have biased data, you can have biased algorithms, you can have biased people who are utilizing your algorithms off target, so it was meant for one thing, but you're using it for something else, and then it malfunctions. So there's a lot of complexity in that. And then, of course, there's also complexity to exactly what you're trying to maximize. So if you're trying to, for example, maximize or rather minimize your false negative ratio, for example, as opposed to minimizing false positives, you're going to end up balancing things differently in the system in such a way that you end up with different results, different notions of fairness come into play, and you say, well, what is fair, what is bias, and what is just in this case? And those are decisions that because we're operating in a new space, they have to be looked at as, as society, looking at them together and saying, we don't like the way this turned out here, you need to change that, and it needs to be fixed. What happens with technology companies is they take the first pass at it, And when they take the first pass, hopefully they've done a good job. But if they don't do a good job, it is the job of society and of government and of other organizations within, the world that we inhabit together to make that critique and say, you've made a mistake here and you need to fix that.
So, Gavin, maybe you could talk a little bit about Facebook's process from detection to verified violation to defined action and then the response. That might be helpful to explain to address that.
Yeah, and I won't talk about Facebook. I think this is true generally in the industry. My comments are very focused on the issue that this panel is talking about, the scenario we had, which is a safety issue. And so to be clear, I don't think any of the companies use algorithms to make decisions, to take decisions. That is not what it's used for. It's used to bring content quickly up for human review. So it's human beings that have to make those decisions and have to understand the context of what they're looking at. So if you have artificial intelligence that is used to identify from 20,000 videos a minute that are being posted, those that look like first-person shooter scenario, there is a very high chance that they will be inaccurate, that you will get instead, for example, some kid playing paintball or children in their home in a Nerf gun battle. And so you can't necessarily use machines to make those decisions, at least not today. So I think most of the companies that use this work, those things are used to flag those for human review, and then humans make a decision. Now, the concept of the hash sharing coalition is to share that human decision-making with other companies so that a small company that might not have the resources to have human review of all this content can see, for example, that this hash of a particular content was identified by another company as being extreme terrorist content. Then they can apply their own policies internally, but it does help speed up the process.
Do we have time for one more question? Over here.
I'm Alex Trigona from Malta. I'm seeing this whole concept of the common good as being quite analogous to the theory and economic theory of public goods. However, I think we must keep in mind that there are common goods or public goods or commons in a locality, in a territorial jurisdiction, a state's jurisdiction, as contradistinguished by the international aspect. And here the common good in the digital age would, to my mind, immediately suggest that we are talking about the essential common good in the digital age, which is the internet itself, from an international perspective and not from a domestic territorial jurisdiction perspective. And one old question, I'm saying both over here, one old question which used to arise in our first meetings on WISEs used to be, who owns the internet? What is the internet? Is it res nullius, property of nobody? Is it res omnia, of everybody? Is it res communis, common good internationally, globally? Is it a global public good? And if so, how could we start thinking of joining a number of the articles and products which we are identifying very richly, and even in the first session this morning, in a domestic territorial domain, with an overarching international architecture? We need to link the two at some stage. It can't remain totally local forever, or just be international by itself without linking to the local. One proposal I modestly put forward at WISES Plus 10 in the United Nations General Assembly is to characterize the internet as common heritage of mankind. So it's common good of what we have today. What have we succeeded to today? And a week later, the Pope himself was caricatured in an Italian newspaper as saying that the internet è un dono di Dio. So it's a gift of God. But let's forget who the Decuius was. It is a heritage, whether divine or not. It is this concept of heritage which has already been legislated upon by the UN on a Maltese initiative, which was to call the seabed beyond territorial jurisdictions, but beyond each state's jurisdiction, the seabed in the ocean and underlying it, common heritage of mankind, and that developed into the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. So there are models which we can look to by analogy if we want to think of how to link the international to the local. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to leave the last couple of minutes. I know is it a brief question or is it is a brief question? Go ahead. Sorry, go on, then I'll take the last one.
So I'm Joshua Lul, the chairman of the Malta Digital Innovation Authority, and what we do is we provide assurances on technology that it does what it's supposed to do. So coming back to what you mentioned before, that can we come up with a stamp of approval to give companies an incentive to actually make sure that their products are ethically aligned or work towards the common good, however we define that. I guess we're going to define that over the next few days. But could we come up with a similar framework where there is this common good aligned framework that you can undergo some sort of audit to make sure that your products are actually aligned with those ethics, and then companies would look to seek to get that certification. So we already have this sort of certification in terms of technology in Malta, but now perhaps we'll start looking towards a new type of ethically aligned certification.
So maybe that's one of the things you could share. One of those, or small groups, make sure that gets recorded into the session, because that'd be very helpful for our proceedings. I want to thank you all. I want to be careful. We've got a couple of minutes left, and I want to give Eric Salbar an opportunity to give some little closing synthesis of what he's heard, both from you and from the panel, so that we can then close. And we will have opportunity at some of those other small groups to bring up some more conversations. Thank you, Eric.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so synthesis is supposed to be brief, so I will be brief. And just give you just a couple of takeaways. First of all, I would say that this is a very good case to start such a conference, because it's a very specific one, and we see that this kind of violence, for sure, is not desirable on the internet. But as we've already said, hate speech can be much more pernicious, and this is just the most accessible part of the iceberg. But a big part of the ethical dilemmas will be much more tricky, because we don't know if it's just cynicism, jokes against a minority. Is it a kind of freedom of speech, or is it, this is a part of the difficulties we have with the concept of non-neutrality of technologies. And that's why I guess some companies fight for a long time to maintain this kind of status of neutrality of technology. And this is just a tool that we provide. But we see that, unfortunately, this is not so simple, and we have to deal with that. And as Mitchell said previously, there's a change in the way we consider truth. And you can imagine that for a Dominican who has Veritas as a motto, this is a big challenge. But I think this is the way it is. And I would say that, just perhaps to come back on this Latin words of insolidum that were pronounced previously in the first panel, I think this is interesting because it says something about the responsibility of the tech ecosystem, I would say. Insolidum means that people are in solidarity for everything. They don't share, like, I'm responsible for step A and Jim for step B. But if there's a gap in between, nobody is responsible for that. It means that all the community is responsible for all the process. And I think that for the public opinion, that's more or less what happens now. And we see that actually they can blame one or another company, but they can also blame all the tech industry, and they can also blame technology by itself, or start to mistrust technology. And I think that could be one of the big problems that we could face. So for sure, this common solidarity is not easy to implement in this context of ferocious competition among companies in the Valley and in the world. And we didn't speak so much about China, but there are other players, and not everybody is so well-intended and so concerned by common good. And so, but this is something that we will have to put at the forefront, just to help companies to switch the mind. What you said about ethics seen as a center of cost. So, this is something you do when you have no choice. But the point is, perhaps they have to change a little bit their mind and to see that profit can be aligned with impact. And there's a way, first perhaps to switch from profit to value, I mean, even share value, but it means that it's more long-term and to build value on values. And this is something that perhaps we try to implement in the head of CEOs of large companies, just to try to, have a kind of change of paradigm. That's what we talked about this morning. And I think this is needed because even for them, because compliance doesn't protect them anymore. I mean, the area of compliance is over. I guess that millenniums take care about the purpose. And they will blame you if they consider that if you didn't do enough, even if you tick all the boxes of the compliance or the norms. So, and I think that at the end of the day, they are right. And so I think that if we want to put at the center this common good, which is just more than, I've done my job, but really I do my best, there's a notion that we try to implement, and Bishop Paul Targ mentioned that earlier this morning, because we work on that very actively together. That's the notion of ethics by design. So how can we manage the innovation process just to be sure that ethics as safety by design is taken in consideration from the very early stage of the blueprint as a basic of the development of the technology, and not waiting the last end to deal with the communication or marketing department and say, okay, what about ethics finally? What will you do? But just, I think that's the best way to have the values really at the core of the technologies which are developed and then proposed to the public. And I think that actually, and I will just finish by that, probably it changes, it requires a big change in the mindset of CEOs and decision makers in the private sector. It requires probably also change, a kind of paradigm shift in the mind of the policymakers, and perhaps, I mean, we cannot only rely on the good guys. I mean, there are many good guys here. Several people mentioned this close meeting we had with top decision makers of the Valley during 2 days about those questions, and so many well-intended people, but are they powerful enough to balance other kind of people? Are they powerful enough to balance other countries that could have a very different mindset and probably would not be so, let's say, eager to take in consideration the common good? I think that this is, perhaps it will require a kind of new kind of governance and new frameworks to allow us to build a trustworthy technology which is built on the common good. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. There will be a lot more discussions. I hope this will provide for you more fodder for your conversations this afternoon and tomorrow. Thank you, and thank you to our panelists.